Good afternoon. So, we're going now into the 8th of these little lectures on liturgy, and I'll carry on where I left off last time, which was looking at some concrete issues guided by the thought of the great liturgist Romano Guardini, who was a pivotal figure in the liturgical movement and an influence, as we see, on the writings of Joseph Ratzinger as he was. Indeed, he deliberately linked up with him in giving the title that he did to his magisterial work on the liturgy, because the seminal work of Romano Guardini in the beginning of the important period of the liturgical movement was one which he wanted to take up and readdress insofar as Pope Benedict, or rather Joseph Ratzinger as he was at the time, was trying to get towards a correct understanding of what the whole thrust of the liturgical movement was, because he was one of the first to observe that actually what had happened after the publication of the document on the liturgy by the Vatican Council is that it was not correctly understood at grassroots level. The application was the problem, not the document. And so he was discreetly angling towards what then became known as a reform of the reform. In other words, to understand exactly what the Holy Spirit was trying to say to the churches and then to follow suit. Because otherwise what we end up is a Protestant mentality, that liturgy is a private affair and that the assembly celebrating is its own patron. Well, it's not quite so simple. Liturgy is actually the organ of prayer of the mystical body and cannot just be hijacked by human impulses. So in that sense, the intuitions that these great authors had, even before the council, are important, especially as they continued writing after the council and tried to get the message across. So I looked at one issue last time with regard to concrete portions of the liturgy which this great author was studying. It was the sign of the cross. I'd like to look now at the hands. So I'll just quote extensively from him and add comments and explode the thing, because it's very powerful, all that he writes. Every single part of our body is an expressive instrument of the soul. That, by the way, is a fundamental principle in all that pertains to liturgy. Expression. Liturgy is not something, as it were, there in mid-air. It is an expression of something interior. It can't be there properly speaking when there's nothing being said. It is the vehicle of what is being said. The soul does not inhabit the body as a man inhabits a house. It lives and works in each member, each fibre, and reveals itself in the body's every line, contour and movement. But the soul's chief instruments and clearest mirrors are the face and hands. The face and hands. We know the difference between actually even recording something, for instance, a homily on just audio, and having access also to it on video. One is speaking twice over when one has video. And so too, in the face, much comes through. Well, these issues have to be also attacked, because we pray with our whole being when it comes to liturgy. Already, actually, in the Protestant way of worshipping, that comes into it. They have less in the realm of the use of the body, but they do have a lot in the realm of the voice, the face, and even the hands. Notably in the communication of the word, they are far more expressive in the communication part than quite often we are. It's interesting to study someone who is an experienced preacher, for instance, using his whole being, and they do engage. It is far more engaging than someone who reads a carefully prepared script and doesn't depart from it, and is perceived to be reading it, because then one is almost in lecture mode, and a part, not all, but a part of the oomph, the power of engagement is lost when there is actually not that contact of eye to eye with the actual congregation, because one sees immediately, if one is looking at one's people, whether such and such is listening or not, and one can see then what one has to do to get back their attention. If one is looking at a page, that is not there, and on their part also it is perceived. They do not engage in the same way when they are not looked at. So it works both ways. The eyes engage, the eyes link up, and so too does the face. The face has its language, and even in prayer, these things enter into mode. If one goes to certain types of prayer groups, one sees the whole being coming into play. Well, to a certain extent, that also happens even in liturgical prayer, because we are called upon to be totally engaged and not just cerebrally engaged with the grey matter alone when it comes to Catholic liturgy. That we have in common with our Oriental roots in Judaism and in the Oriental family of the East, our brethren who in the Eastern rites use very much their body and totally. And that was not necessarily the wish of the Council Fathers when it came to the streamlining of liturgy with the liturgical reform. In practice, what actually happened at grassroots level is that it was seen to be easy to drop things, but then the other part didn't happen. So what actually happened was this. We ended up with only the said Mass in most places, at least in Ireland. And that was not at all the intention of the Council Fathers. What had been the norm in any fairly large parish throughout the land would have been at least one fairly carefully prepared celebration amongst the others, which would have been low masses. But that was the one that in practice was jettisoned, and then all the others became the norm. So we've actually lost rather than gained in Ireland as regards that one possibility that one could have wherever one went, at least in a town situation. That element of care given and all the parts of the body and the physicity of the church itself and all that we can use to make things suggestive and elevating was actually just discontinued, often under the guise of noble simplicity, but actually in practice, if we're honest, quite often out of plain laziness. And unfortunately, it's been aggravated by the fact that now, with a smaller number of priests doing the same amount of work as the larger number before, those priests have many celebrations one after the other, and therefore they really can't face greater complication than what they already have. So it's militating against the possibility of the total engagement of the person and of all we have in our capacity to express otherness with our whole being and all that we can create. To create beauty is demanding. It demands attention, time, self-sacrifice. And so we can see how very easily one slips into a rut. All that to say that we must understand correctly that the liturgical movement was not at all in view of that element of robbing the majesty of God from his cloak of glory. It was quite different, but in practice, at grassroots level, that is what we ended up with. So we have to be very much aware of why Cardinal Ratzinger and the experts who are militating in the same direction are concerned that actually we are being shortchanged in our generation as compared with those who went before us, who had, if they wanted, easy access once a week to, yes, the mystical, the other, the beyond, the totally engaging and absorbing. Now, if we're not careful, we have a very short celebration, even at the highest point of our week. It's not enough for the hungry soul. God needs time to get through to us. We need time to get out of time. Otherwise, all we're doing in church is spending the first 10 minutes letting go of what we've brought in with us in our head, and the time immediately after Holy Communion listening to the church bulletin being read out, or whatever it might be. In other words, the mystical has gone. And then we get worse by actually making it that much human again by talking a lot before and after, even in the place of God. So when we compare this with the experience that only 1 or 2 generations ago our ancestors had, we see that they, if they wanted now, only if they wanted, but they did, quite a few of them, would have access, more easy access, to a quiet and prolonged time with the Lord of Lords, who is actually outside time and finds it difficult to fit into our hurried timetables. If we have on a Sunday more of that hurry, then we are being very much damaged as a human species. Hurry is already built into our life, and if our celebrations on a Sunday are more of the same thing, woe betide humankind. And I'm sure old Nick is very happy. So just be aware, liturgy concerns us all, and we need the healing of the emotions. We need access to something nobilitating, elevating, healing, tranquilizing, soothing. And if we don't get it even in church, all we have is what we have in the supermarket, from Monday to Saturday, and now Sunday included. It's not enough for our needs. We need times when we can actually switch off from hurry and have gratuitous time of beauty and elevation. We have a right to the other, at least in our Catholic life. It's what the Church has had always and can still offer. And if one doesn't get it easily in where one is, one can now, with cars, now and again travel around to find it, because they're still there. There are places which actually do honour God with as much as can be done, but nowadays one has to look around for them a little. But they're still there. They're still there. Fortunately, there is one element which does limit things to some extent in our Catholic life. It's the fact that we have the contemplative life, and therefore there are places dotted around which only do that. Places which have as their function in the Church to honour and worship and adore, and therefore they will tendentially give a lot of attention to it. So one can be healed by going to a place of perpetual prayer where actually God is given the maximum. And then participation is seen to be what it can be. It can be just on the level of the soul. Without having to do everything that possibly can be done, one can actually participate with the heart and the mind in contemplation, letting things happen a little around one without having to be distracted by making them happen, because unfortunately that's part of the problem. In the interest of getting everyone to do everything, we've lost that possibility of just letting it happen and resting upon beauty which carries us. So I return now to this specific issue, the expression of the soul by the body. So he says, of the face, this is obviously true. But if you will watch other people or yourself, you will notice how instantly every slightest feeling, pleasure, surprise, suspense, shows, now, you wouldn't expect this bit, in the hand. If one looks at how people behave in conversation, one notices that the hand is actually quite often doing something when it hasn't got anything to do. It's a displacement activity, it's absorbing waste energy, and it's always fidgeting at something and indicating the person is actually somewhat tensed up. Very few people can actually talk without moving at all. Interesting to compare human behavior. A quick lifting of the hand or a flicker of the fingers says far more than words. By comparison with a language so natural and expressive, the spoken word is clumsy. Next to the face, the part of the body fullest of mind is the hand. It is a hard, strong tool for work. a ready weapon of attack and defense, but also, with this delicate structure and network of innumerable nerves, it is adaptable, flexible, and highly sensitive. It is a skillful, workmanlike contrivance for the soul to make herself known by. It is also an organ of receptivity for matter from outside ourselves. For when we clasp the extended hand of a stranger, are we not receiving from a foreign source the confidence, pleasure, sympathy, or sorrow that his hand conveys? That, by the way, is interesting. There's a lot in a good hand clasp, not just a shake, but actually letting the person, as it were, feel the current paths, holding that person's hand with a sense of engagement. It's only a small thing, but it concerns us on a daily level. We can express that we care with the hand, silently and well. Therefore, our body speaks, and this is a basic law of liturgy. So, it could not but be that in prayer, where the soul has so much to say, so much to learn, God, where she gives herself to him and receives him to himself, the hand should take actually upon itself expressive forms of engagement with God himself. Now this then we're going to see in some detail. When we enter into ourselves and the soul is alone with God, our hands closely interlock. If one looks at different postures for prayer, one sees how in different traditions there is a language already. It is not indifferent if one invites people, when one puts up an oratory for adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, if one provides comfortable armchairs or kneelers or taizé stools, little kneelers which are on the ground, they're everywhere now, or if one doesn't provide anything at all which allows one to kneel. In some places, as in Mother Teresa's places, they only have a mat or a carpet. There is nothing there. In fact, when we were in Rome, the nuns who were Indians used to look after us. They only had the carpet in their chapel. All according to the culture. But what these nuns would do was that they would use their body, and the very fact of being in a humble, receptive posture was already a part of their prayer. So it is already a statement and a part of our prayer if we decide to spend our whole adoration sitting comfortably. It's not quite the same act. And also, it is not necessarily the best place to preach a sermon when Blessed Sacrament is exposed. They're not quite the same kind of dynamism when one is actually kneeling and when one is listening to a person even preaching, because actually adoration has its own rules and dynamics, and it should therefore be purely vertical. The natural posture of the creature before its creator when adoring is to express what that word adoring contains. The os is ad. The os is the mouth or the face, and the ad is downwards. It's actually prostrating itself. So the thrust is down before, and therefore to express that sitting down is actually a bit incongruous. Therefore the body already is deciding whether it's going to fully engage in that adoration, in that worship. We worship with our whole being. As I say, if we don't do that, we're getting into a Protestant mode. It is true that some people cannot kneel. It is true also that some people cannot kneel for all that time. But there are ways and means of not just abdicating totally. It's not the same to sit backwards comfortably before the Lord of Hosts as it is at least to have one's head bowed. There are ways and means of compensating if one isn't totally possible. But let us get this straight. Our cult is not Protestant. It's Catholic, it's incarnational. All the senses take part in it and adore. So, this element then of the way that the hands actually engage when in prayer enters into it. he goes on like this: when we enter into ourselves and the soul is alone with God, our hands closely interlock, finger clasped in finger, in a gesture of compression and control. It is as if we would prevent the inner current from escaping by conducting it from hand to hand, and so back again to God, who is within us, holding it there. It is as if we were collecting all our forces in order to keep guard over the hidden God, so that he who is mine and I who am his should be left alone together. Our hands take the same position when some dire need or pain weighs heavily on us and threatens to break out. Hand then locks in hand, and the soul struggles with itself until it gets control and grows quiet again. Now, liturgically speaking, in the West, different from the East actually, they have a different way, but in the West, it is fairly universal that the liturgical mode of holding the hands when standing is in roughly 45 degrees. One sees it everywhere. People who are well formed, bishops, priests, and popes who are traditionally formed, will still use that ancient rite, which is something of the rite of court, attending a great lord. One is attentive. Therefore, one's arms are not just hanging down, but they're there joined with hands, as in the praying hands of Albert Dürer, those praying hands, only with that difference that the thumbs traditionally in the Western Rite are crossed. It's the right thumb over the left. And so that has gone on for many generations and is still there out of instinct. And it's a good thing to form the altar boys into that from the beginning, because if they don't get formed from the beginning, they will never get into it, and they will get into bad habits. One sees it around. Those hands, when they're not free, start playing around with their cincture and all that might be available to play around with, and it's not the best and edifying way to be in mode of attention to the great king. Those hands, when they're vertical, or that is 45 degrees like that, engaged, are far more reverent, and the whole person is seen to be attentive and ready for an instruction, just giving all his attention to the Lord, and also waiting for a command from those who might be indicating what needs to be done, because one needs to be always awake when celebrating or in any way involved in the celebration, because things can go wrong, and one needs to be aware that there might be something to be addressed at the last moment which wasn't actually programmed, therefore fully switched on. But when we stand in God's presence in heartfelt reverence and humility, the open hands are laid together palm against palm in sign of steadfast subjection and obedient homage, as if to say that the words we ourselves would speak are in good order, and that we are ready and attentive to hear the words of God. Or it may be a sign of inner surrender. These hands, our weapons of defense, are laid, as it were, tied and bound together between the hands of God. Indeed, when one makes one's commitment either to an abbot or to a bishop, those hands are put in that joined form between the joined hands of the prelate, and one makes one's commitment of obedience. That goes back to feudal times, and it is a very moving gesture. In moments of jubilant thanksgiving, when the soul is entirely open to God, with every reserve done away, and every passage of its instrument unstopped, and it flows the full outwards and upwards, then the hands are uplifted and spread apart, with the palms up, to let the river of the Spirit stream out unhindered, and to receive in turn the water for which it thirsts. So too, when we long for God and cry out to Him. Now, that is still there. The orante, the praying mode, goes back to the early church and can still be seen in the catacombs, in frescoes. The orante is not the hands pointing together, one towards the other, but pointing outwards. And that is something which is still vestigially present in the way that the priest holds his hands, both in the canon, the Eucharistic prayer, and in the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father. It's also there in the use of the hands extended at the collect and other solemn moments of praying. But by now they have become more towards each other. Indeed, for quite a long time, the old rubric was that they had to be extended that far, that is, not outside the shoulders of the celebrant, so actually they weren't really seen. But that's been addressed now in the conciliar ears, so that it actually should be seen for what it is. It's an extension of the hands, extension. But that is very ancient. It's also Hebrew, and we see that the Hebrews had that mode of praying with uplifted hands. In fact, we have St. Paul urging in his pastorals that there should be prayer made and that people should be lifting up holy hands. So that's interesting. We have this element which is already of Judaic origin still maintained in our worship. The hands enter into it. And indeed, in that spontaneous renewal that we have in the charismatic renewal of prayer, we have the body coming in, and that is very much a part of the charismatic way of praying. The hands have been rediscovered as organs of communication of prayer and praise and supplication, the whole body entering in. Indeed, it was also for many centuries a position of penance, and it's still practiced by some, the extension of the hands in the form of a cross. And in the Carthusian Rite, the way of extending the hands during the long canon at Mass itself was not in the Roman way like that, but actually as the Lord would have been on the cross, they're completely outstretched, and that gives the look of the priest as a T shape, therefore expressing the cross with his whole being, but they're completely outstretched in the Carthusian Rite. That is one particular family within the rites which have gone on from time immemorial. In the Carmelite Rite, at the moment of asking the angel to carry the sacrifice, the offering up to the altar in heaven, different from the Roman Rite, where the priest has his hands at the altar together, the Carmelites had the arms crossed over the breast, one crossed over the other. And that was an expression of great humility. So the praise comes into it, and it is something also which has been put back for what it's worth in the invitation to the priest to do well the gestures at the beginning of the Eucharistic prayer, that is, at the beginning of the preface itself, lifting them up properly, not vestigially, but properly, so that one is lifting up one's heart and one's body at that time. Lift up your hearts, and those should be really elevated at that point. And then, now, the instruction is to make them outstretched again. It is give thanks to the Lord our God. In the old rite, they were brought together at that point, and the priest would bow, expressing there before the cross his littleness. Finally, when sacrifice is called for, and we gather together all we are and all we have, and offer ourselves to God with full consent, then we lay our arms over our breast and make with them the sign of the cross. But there are other moments in which we also express our humility with our hands. It's still there. It's there at the Confiteor, and now it's been restored in the correct translation that we have retrieved there in English. It's actually 3 times, whereas it had been simplified to once, where it was still 3 in the Latin original, and there was no reason for it to change. It's far more humble. Through my fault, that's there, expressing it. But it's also in the canon, the old canon, the priest still makes that sign to us also sinners. Nobis quoque peccatoribus. And by the way, in the old rite, that's the only bit that was actually heard audibly, those 3 words, associating the people with that cry of humility. But these can be done, again, without thought, or they can be done engaging, because if these are done humbly, they do express the sorrow of the heart. Indeed, in the Trappist language, to say sorry, one just makes that sign. One says with hitting one's breast. And even instinctively in conversation, we still do that kind of thing. I'm very sorry, we sometimes do that, hitting our breast. But they are languages which are spontaneous to the human heart and mind and body. Let us make these with actually interiority. Anything which is worth doing in liturgy is worth doing twice over, with the body and with the heart and mind engaged. Otherwise, it's purely cosmetic. There is greatness and beauty in this language of the hands. The Church tells us that God has given us our hands in order that we may carry our souls in them. That comes from the Psalm. It's Psalm 118. Anima mea in manibus meis. My soul is in my hands. The Church is fully in earnest in the use she makes of the language of gesture. She speaks through it her inmost mind, and God gives ear to this mode of speaking. Our hands may also indicate the goods we lack, our unchecked impulses, our distractions and other faults. And by the way, in liturgical composure, it's good to inculcate, especially in those who are starting to serve, but in any person involved in anything to do with the altar, that element of awareness of the body. All that we do with the body in the sacred sphere is participating in the virtue of religion, the virtue which religare, which binds us to God. We're using the body to express majesty, and therefore it's important that we be in that majestic mode ourselves and not more of the same thing. There's a difference between swinging the arms and holding them in that position of 45 degrees. It's quite different, and one should never be walking around swinging the arms. Let us hold them as the Church directs us then, and see to it that there is a real correspondence between the interior and exterior attitudes. In matters such as this, we are on delicate ground. Remember that the ground that we're actually standing on is extraterritorial. It belongs not to the geography of this land, it's claimed by God, and therefore it's His palace. The word in Hebrew for the temple is hachechal, the palace of the king. It's the palace, and therefore we're in His palace, and He is enthroned therein, and we are attentive as pawns and wards, as little servants and satellites. We are His soldiers, and therefore we are in upright position, ready for an order, and not lounging around. And it's dreadful, actually, if one sits and crosses one's legs. That's really a laid-back attitude, which is not the best that we should offer to the angel presence around us, who are certainly far more attentive than we are. We give attention, not laziness, to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And that starts with a bodily posture. Indeed, when in Rome, I noticed how those of our brethren from Asiatic cultures, when they went into prayer mode, were very, very still and erect. They could stay still in meditation for half an hour without shifting, and they were erect, sitting but erect, and not lounging around. It was already a prayer and a receptive mode. We would prefer not to talk about things of this order, he says. Something within us objects. Let us then avoid all empty and unreal talk and concentrate the more carefully on the actual doing. That is a form of speech by which the plain realities of the body say to God what its soul means and intends. So we'll have a little pause there at the end of that section by Romano Guardini, remembering that he knows what he's talking about, and to lounge around in the king's high palace is another insult and indeed another thorn in the Sacred Heart. And so we return to our uplifted body, our body called upon to express its guest, that is the soul, and indeed the soul's own inhabitant, the Blessed Trinity. We look now at one specific issue, that of the posture of kneeling. when a man feels proud of himself, he stands erect, draws himself to his full height, throws back his head and shoulders, and says with every part of his body, I am bigger and more important than you. When he is humble, he feels his littleness and lowers his head and shrinks into himself. He abases himself, and the greater the presence in which he stands, the more deeply he abases himself, the smaller he becomes in his own eyes. But when does our littleness so come home to us as when we stand in God's presence? He is the great God, who is today and yesterday, whose ears are hundreds and thousands, who fills the place where we are, the city, the whole world, the measureless space of the starry sky, in whose eyes the universe is less than a particle of dust, all holy, all pure, all righteous, infinitely high. He is so great, I so small, that beside him I seem hardly to exist. So wanting am I in worth and substance. One has no need to be told that God's presence is not the place in which to stand on one's dignity. To appear less presumptuous, to be as little and low as we feel, we sink to our knees and thus sacrifice half our height. And to satisfy our hearts still further, we bow down our heads, and our diminished stature speaks to God and says, Thou art the great God, I am nothing. Therefore, let not the bending of our knees be a hurried gesture, an empty form. Put meaning into it. To kneel, in the soul's intention, is to bow down before God in deepest reverence. On entering a church, or in passing before the altar, kneel down all the way without haste or hurry, putting your heart into what you do, and let your whole attitude say, Thou art the great God. It is an act of humility, an act of truth, and every time you kneel, it will do your soul good. Now, the Spirit was putting on the hearts of the Council Fathers that there should be this meaningfulness of every gesture in the Reformed liturgy. Hence, there was the indication that we had to find again the main lines of architecture of the liturgical operation, not the overgrowth which had made it difficult to see those main lines and the simplicity and noble beauty of this wonderful cathedral that we had inherited, that is, the cathedral of well-executed liturgy. And therefore, we have to be aware that there had been this very large multiplication of all these gestures over the centuries. With the Council of Trent, the different families of liturgy which they had been maintained, and therefore we had all the genuflections and signs of the cross that each of these had, and so we had therefore a very large number when they were put together, because they didn't drop things, they kept things, but they were keeping them from different families, and so we had the very large number of gestures. Now in practice, if one is celebrating in the unchanged liturgy, the one that has come to us now as the extraordinary form, one still has this very large number of genuflections, and the result is that if one isn't careful, at least, one can get into a kind of automatism, and one can make a genuflection, because they're so frequent in there, without really being fully aware of the whole thrust that each one should contain. And therefore, the drastic reduction of genuflections during the liturgy itself was deliberate. But it had to be in view of the other thing, and that sometimes is not there. So we have to be careful, otherwise we lose everything. We don't get the benefit of renewal. If one is therefore making, in place of many, many genuflections or many, many signs of the cross, 1 or 2 or 3, it is important that it be well made. The instructions given now for the sacred liturgy are as follows. When one is coming in to the sanctuary area, if the Blessed Sacrament is before one, then one makes a genuflection at that point, celebrant, deacon, and all the court of assistants. But until the consecration, one does not then make other genuflections. One makes a profound bow to the centre of attention during the celebration, which is the altar. Because otherwise, and this is the thinking between the lines, one is confusing the issue, because the thrust then has to be towards awaiting the coming of the Lord and honouring it when it is there. Therefore, one makes mental abstraction of the reserve of the Lord in the tabernacle during the celebration until then the last moment when one is receding, and then one altogether makes a genuflection again if the tabernacle is before one. That's just to be clear of what the rationale is in the thinking of the present rubrics. However, one does honour the rock of the altar as the representation of Christ the rock, the sacrifice of Calvary. One honours that, but with a profound bow each time one crosses it. And after the consecration, one does make a genuflection. The altar boys must make a genuflection if they are crossing after the consecration, because there precisely the awaited presence has come. And that has to be happening. Also, the people approaching the Blessed Sacrament, if they are receiving kneeling, by the act of kneeling are doing what is sufficient, and that is the requested reverence, if that is their form of receiving. If they are receiving standing, then they are instructed to make a reverence before they actually receive. In our monastery, that was done with a moment of genuflection. It can also be done with a profound bow. One can, of course, combine the two by receiving Holy Communion in that moment of genuflection, which is a compromised solution, but it can be done. Therefore, Holy Communion is received there in a kneeling position on one knee. That is a compromise, to say, which can happen without too much fuss or bother, but it does satisfy the obligation to make a moment of reverence, because it's not enough, and it's still there in the instructions given. And John Paul II was very insistent on it in his document on the Eucharist. Actually, in one of the documents, I think it was probably maybe something to do with the Holy Thursday letter he would write to all the priests and bishops of the world. But anyway, he did insist upon that it was still there, this notion of making a reverence if one was standing to receive Holy Communion. But it's actually still in the instructions given for everyone that there has to be that element. Otherwise, if one is approaching without any sign of reverence first, then one is actually coming into a equal to equal mode. One is coming into that mode of standing which Guardini has just mentioned there in this paragraph I read, that one is not actually coming in that mode of littleness, but of equalness to the great King. And that is questionable. It's actually visible if one observes how some people do actually do that, and even some with crossed hands or whatever it might be, There's an element of casualness which has come there, which is not the correct mode of interpretation of the freedom of choice. And in fact, to take away that freedom of choice is negative, and it's a new form of clericalism. It's unhealthy to take away the legitimate choice which people have. And to enforce one's preference on a person at that moment of Holy Communion is a lack of delicacy. It's a lack of understanding of human dynamics. And the encounter of a soul with its God at that point is so intimate that in any way to be in the way of it by some unpleasant act or look or whatever it might be is the height of spiritual rudeness. One does not interrupt the encounter of a soul with its Creator with any kind of lack of delicacy. One stands aside before the mystery of encounter. One serves it and doesn't draw attention to oneself at that moment. So, one allows the Holy Spirit to put on the hearts of people the expression of praise which they have in their deepest being. People are allowed to express what they feel, and why should we reduce that to our own mode? It's rather harsh that we actually, in the interest of renewal, have become less renewed than those who went before us, because at least they did not interrupt people's devotion. I conclude, the body enters into it, and if we're worshipping God, we're worshipping Him with the consecration of the limbs that He gave us. We gave the best of what He gave to us, and in so doing we uplift the whole of creation, for we're the only part of creation that has thought. The animals, even the plants, worship God in their silent mode. We engage with the mind, but we must engage, otherwise too we are nothing more than sacred automata.